So it's going to be a little different at home than up here, just because this is going to come in intervals, where at home it's just going to be the entire slide at one time. All right, so we're going to be looking at Matthew. If you note here, I refer to Matthew as a gospel. And the reason I put that, a gospel record, the reason I put that is because when we consider or refer to them as the Gospels, right? Well, actually, one of the writers in World Bible Bible School said, well, there's only one gospel, right? These are just accounts of the same gospel. So, which, you can't disagree with. There's only one gospel message. And so this is just Matthew's account of the gospel. And so it's a gospel record. It's his account, inspired, of course, as to what God wanted him to write in regards to Christ and that gospel record. All right. So first we're going to take a look at the authorship. Who wrote the book of Matthew? Matthew, the tax collector, is the one that it is accredited to, right? But there is some issues with that. Not negative, in any way. It's just evidence of authorship. The book itself doesn't say Matthew wrote it, right? Like when you look at some of the epistles that Paul writes, he introduces himself as the writer. Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, right? Luke does that, right? But in Matthew, we don't have it introduced that way. The earliest extant church father writings held to the tradition that Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew in Hebrew. And there is a couple of writings out there where they mention that Matthew was originally written in a Hebrew language and then translated into Greek. And I'll show you some stuff here in just a second if it shows up. Papias was the earliest to mention Matthew. Therefore, Matthew wrote down the sayings in the Hebrew dialect, and each man translated as he was able. Eusebius, Ecclesiastical, History, and there's a reference to it. The meaning of Papias is reference to the sayings. Ta logia is unclear. What does he mean by the sayings, right? So, an early writer, one of the church fathers, mentions the fact that Matthew, he accredited it to Matthew, and said that Matthew wrote it, but he said in the Hebrew dialect. Another second century father, Irenaeus, said Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome. Well, one of the issues with this is we don't have record of Peter ever preaching in Rome. He says this, but we don't have record of it. And so some will call into question that. They'll say, well, if he got that wrong, is it possible that he got, this wrong, that it was written in a Hebrew tongue or dialect prior to this time? The relative unimportance of Matthew the apostle in the gospel. He is only mentioned by name in the apostle list and in the calling account of the gospel of Matthew. So Matthew stands out really as an unimportant figure. The first book of the New Testament, and considered to be the first gospel account written, but really, when you go through the line of the apostles, how many do you read of beyond that early founding of the church? They all seem to just go about whatever they're going to do, and we don't hear from them anymore. Matthew is one of those individuals. So going back and looking at where he's mentioned, works both as an argument against and for his authorship. In some scholarly circles, the Apostle Matthew's obscurity strengthens the likelihood of his authorship of Matthew. The fact that Matthew's name is consistently attached to the gospel in the first centuries of the church, rather than the name of a more recognizable apostle, strengthened the case for the authenticity of his authorship. So, when we look at Matthew and where he just seems to disappear in the line of the church history, some would say, well, that really will support the fact that he wrote this, because there were other well-known apostles out there, and their names aren't attached to it. So if the early church accepted it as being authored by Matthew, then that's what they did. They accepted it as such, the early church fathers. It's mentioned in other writings that Matthew wrote it. And so, and when you go back and you look at historical word of mouth type of thing, so you start off, right? Irenaeus is connected to Polycarp, and Polycarp is connected to who? Remember who? John, yeah. So Polycarp is connected to John. So if Irenaeus is saying this, and then you've got Polycarp who is connected to Irenaeus, Irenaeus is connected to John, then you have some, at least some support there that if he's saying this, he got it from someplace, and the church was accepting this as written by Matthew. On the other hand, though, Matthew being lesser known prompts critics to suggest that Matthew is merely a play on the word disciple, mathetes, and not an indication that Matthew, the apostle, was the author of the gospel. That's similar to what you see in Luke. When Luke speaks, he writes to Theophilus, right, which is lover of God. And so they say, was Theophilus an actual person, or was Theophilus just making a statement to a man or someone who is a lover of God, as with this one, using Matthew as just a reference to a disciple, the disciple. But here's the thing about names. When you go back and look at biblical names, they all had meanings like that, right? They all had meanings to the names that meant some, not all, but the ones that we know of, a big connect, a lot of them had connections to, Savior, things like that. So just to say that because his name means disciple, means Matthew wasn't the author, it was just some disciple. Well, you can do that with other names as well. You can say, like, for example, Theophilus. Well, it wasn't really a person, but people were named after particular acts, right? Like I got these right now. I know some individuals who all have biblical names. They have Jeremiah. I know an individual's name is Messiah. I don't know why they named him Messiah, but they did. Messiah, Isaiah, right? Those names are connected. And if you ask the parents why they named their kids that name, what would they probably more likely say? Biblical names, right? Comes from the Bible, And if you know these kids, if you know somebody's got these kids, the entire family's named all these biblical names, then you would almost assume, or you could pretty closely establish that these people are probably religious in nature, right? I mean, you don't name your kid after old biblical names and not have some kind of religious connection. So, again, looking at the authorship, the evidence, the relative unimportance of Matthew, the apostle, in the gospel. He is only mentioned by name in the apostles list and in the calling account of the gospel of Matthew. Works both for and against. The fact that he was little known can be evidence that he was the author of it. The fact that, but on the other hand, they say, it may not even be him at all. But really, in the end, it doesn't make a difference, because the most solid evidence we have for Matthew being the author is the early church. That's the most solid evidence. So we go back to the church fathers. They make reference to it. No one, and for years, no one questioned it. They all accepted it because it had been passed down from generation to generation that this is the one who wrote it. So there was no reason for them to question that. And so, unless there's evidence, and let me, one other thing. The whole thing about, they said that he wrote, like Irenaeus said that he wrote Matthew in Hebrew first, and then, in the Hebrew dialect first. This is kind of like the Q argument. There's no manuscript of that anywhere. We don't have a Hebrew transcript of Matthew at all. So they said that, but where's the evidence of it? There's no textual support of it.
Also, Matthew being a tax collector, my understanding is that that gospel covers giving quite extensively, quite often. Money, giving, and that type of thing. So I've not really sit down line for line and pen it out.
That'd be an interesting.
I've heard it taught that way, that's
That you find that in there. Which, if that's the case, that would be in line with how God would use a particular individual, right? Right from what what they know. So, yeah. All right, let's take a look now at Matthew's background about the author. Who is Matthew? What do we know about Matthew? Matthew, the apostle, a Jew, his name in Hebrew means gift of Yahweh. So in Hebrew, we have gift of Yahweh. Again, one of those names that means something, right? A tax collector of Capernaum, engaged in taxing fishermen like Peter, whom Jesus called into discipleship in Matthew chapter 9 and verse 9, and later appointed as one of the 12 apostles in 10:3. The early church identified the first book of the New Testament as the Gospel according to Matthew, that's a good way to put it too, the Gospel according to Matthew. So it's the Gospel according to Matthew. All three synopses place the call of Matthew after the healing of the paralytic and Jesus' pronouncement of his right to forgive sins in Matthew chapter 9, 1 through 8, and before the dinner for tax collectors and sinners in verses 10 through 13 of the same book and chapter. Thus identifying Matthew as one of the sinners, verse 13, to whom Jesus offers forgiveness. So he may have been in that crowd when Jesus was doing this. And if you go back and you look at where this would fall, in what place it falls, the call to Matthew, this is where it is. So it's very possible that he was one of the sinners, verse 13, to whom Jesus offers forgiveness. Matthew's response to Jesus is obedient, decisive, and sacrificial. You find that in Luke chapter 5 and verse 28. Let's take a look over there. The character of the individual, when he responds in a very decisive way. It's not something where he's him-hawing around about the thing, right? Questioning and doubting and struggling with his decision. In verse 27, Luke chapter 5, after that he went out and noticed a tax collector named Levi sitting in the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he left everything behind and got up and began to follow him. Now, if we go back to the previous point here, where we look at the call of Matthew coming after the healing of the paralytic, and Jesus' pronouncement to forgive sins in Matthew chapter 9, 1-8, and before the dinner for tax collectors and sinners in verses 10 through 13, it kind of gives weight to why Matthew did this, right? So if we look over here in Luke, when Jesus comes up and sees him sitting there, he tells him to follow me, and he left everything, right? Well, what was it that just caused Matthew to get up and just leave everything? Because Jesus says, follow me. You know, we don't have Jesus at the point yet where we see him later on with the working of the multiple miracles, and we don't see that happening, not to that extent yet. So when Matthew follows him, there's a reason for him doing that. And again, it could go back to what we see with when Matthew is called. If he's at that dinner and Jesus is speaking and he makes that pronouncement, then when he meets him and calls him, he's ready to go because of what Jesus has already said to him. So his response is obedient, decisive, sacrificial. Both Mark and Luke call the tax collector Levi in place of Matthew. A personal name, Matthew, would be more natural choice than a tribal name, Levi, right? So they're calling him by a tribal name, Levi, for identifying oneself. Mark and Luke locate the dinner at Levi's house, right? And if he's Levi and the dinner is at Levi's house, then again we have support that he is there when Jesus makes that pronouncement and thus is willing to follow him. But Matthew, in the house, words one might use of his own house, right? So when you take a look at how Mark and Luke say it, they mention that this meal takes place in Levi's house. But when Matthew writes his account, he says what? In the house. Well, why? And this is one of those things where people say, well, there's a difference. Why did these two say Levi, and why did he say the house? Well, because if it was his house, he would write it in the house. As the other two were writing it, they're making mention of him, and so they would say, in Levi's house. So, not a contradiction, just from the writer's perspective, Matthew would write it from his perspective in the house, and Mark and Luke would write it from theirs.
So why would Mark and Luke not
So if you're looking at Matthew, and we're not, and that's more a common personal name, if they're not yet at that relationship with him, he's the tax collector, right? So they refer to him, and it's possibly this reason, because of that lack of association, because what takes place at that point, before he's called, what's their relationship with him? And then from that point on, they're referring to him as, well, he's Levi, who he is, a tax collector. Whereas after that point in time, when he's called, then they refer to him more in a personal name, Matthew. So that may be the reason why it unfolds in that way, right? All right. In all three lists of the 12 apostles, Matthew appears, but Matthew alone speaks of Matthew, the tax collector. So Matthew refers to himself in his account as Matthew, the tax collector. Besides distinguishing this Matthew from other tax collectors, as Matthew's self-designation would also recall the life of which Jesus had called him. So in him writing that account and referring to himself in that way, and this is one of the reasons as you go through and you say, it's statements like this that lend credibility to him being the author. Okay, why does he refer to it this way? And again, in this case, why in his account does he write his name down as Matthew, the tax collector? Well, I think it's pointed because it's referring to a past profession that was what?
Like the IRS, I didn't like.
Oh, worse, yeah. Not well spoken of. Because they made their money off of over-collecting taxes. So they were not liked by the Jewish people. And these individuals also knew themselves that they were shysters, that what they were doing in taxing the people and overtaxing them, they were taking money that, really was just way too much they should have been taking. So when he's being called out of that life, when he mentions himself in Matthew, referring to himself as a tax collector there seems to be in line because he's reminding people of where he's come from and where he now is. But if you go back and you look into Mark and Luke, he just refers to as Matthew alone. Why would you think that? Why did Mark and Luke just refer to him as Matthew and not Matthew the tax collector?
Because he was apostle.
Okay, so now they're writing beyond that time of Levi, right? They're writing from beyond the time of Levi. Now they're writing about a fellow apostle, a brother. And so now they're going to refer to him in that personal name, Matthew. Where Matthew, when he writes about himself, and look, we've done things like that about ourselves as well, where we mention some past mistakes of ours in showing gratitude for where the Lord has brought us. And so Matthew mentioned himself that way, is doing so possibly because he wants to add weight to what he's writing about here. And when we get to look at the theme and what he's trying to do, what in the writing, he's adding that weight to it. I used to be the tax collector, but I was called. And what am I now? I'm an apostle of Christ. Jesus called me. I left that behind. So, and again, when Mark and Luke refer to him as Matthew, of course, we're beyond that point in time where he's now, let me go to this one, where he's now an apostle. Am I on the right one there? Let me see. No, right here. Matthew names the 12 at the point where Jesus sends them forth with the message of the kingdom, Matthew chapter 10, 1 through 8. Did Jesus confer the name Matthew upon Levi as a sign of apostleship? In Matthew 10:2, Simon is called Peter. With 9:9, a man sitting at the tax collector's booth called Matthew. If Matthew is a Christian name, this would help to explain why Levi occurs only in accounts of his call in Mark and Luke, right? Because in Mark and Luke, if Matthew is the Christian name he's going to use, right? Very similar to whom? Okay? Peter. Very similar to moving away from Saul to Paul, going from a Jewish name to a Greek name, right? So very similar to that. So if Matthew is a Christian name, this would help to explain why Levi occurs in Mark and Luke, because at that point, he's not yet been called. And then Matthew, everywhere else, because after that point, he's been called, and he begins to be referred to as Matthew. And again, that it just ties together about his background and where he came from, and eventually what he becomes as a writer. And let me bring this up. It's interesting, if you can, to go back and look at some of these facts as much as you can know about these people. And most of what you're going to find is going to be within the text. I mean, that's what we're finding here, right? We're looking at the text itself, and we're seeing, what does the text say? Why is he called Levi, and then why is he called Matthew, and where does this transpire, and why, right? And so you can kind of build an argument. But it's interesting when you go back, because if you'll note these things in the writings about him, and then as much information as you can find outside the Bible, then it gives you a clear picture of why this individual was chosen to write this particular gospel when you go back and look at his history. And if you look at the audience of Matthew, most definitely Matthew's written to everybody, right? I mean, it's intended for everybody. But there is a particular audience, and the particular audience is going to be the Jews. Because when you look at the purpose of Matthew, what he's trying to accomplish in it, it is the Jews that are going to pick up on this message first. The Gentiles, they're not going to connect with the Messiahship, with the fulfillment of prophecy. They're not going to connect with that the way the Jews are. Matthew's going to emphasize the kingdom. He's going to emphasize the Father. He's going to emphasize things that appeal to the Jews far more than they would to the Gentiles. And so going back then and looking at his history, using Levi, that tribal name, as part of it, it helps us to understand his work, what he was doing, and then why he would have been used to write a particular document. As Mark 2:12 identifies Matthew as Levi, son of Alphaeus, it is possible that James and Levi are brothers, yet this is unlikely, for the evangelists do not make the identification explicit as they do in the case of Peter and Andrew and the sons of Zebedee. So, because you see this, we have Levi and James, they're both mentioned as sons of Alphaeus. Well, I mean, it's not like Alphaeus was an uncommon name. So, but there's a possibility there. But when you go back and you look at Peter and Andrew, it's very explicit there that you have him being referred to as the sons of Zebedee. Matthew is among those gathered to wait the coming of the Holy Spirit in Acts chapter 1:13, right? Acts 1:13 in the upper room. The New Testament record records nothing of his activity beyond that point. So we get to Acts chapter 1. The Lord is with them. They watch him ascend into the heavens, right? Verse 8, they ask the question, is it this time you're going to restore the kingdom? Verses 6 through 8. And he tells them, you're going to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the remotest parts of the world. And then he ascends into the heaven, and they're watching, and the angels appear and ask him what they're doing. Watching that man, he's going to return the same way he left, in the clouds. And then they go to Jerusalem. He tells them, Jesus told them to go to Jerusalem. They go there. We have the account of, they're all gathered in that upper room. His name's mentioned there. And that's it. Nothing beyond that point. Now, we have mention of the apostles, right? Acts chapter 6, when they come to the apostles in the discussion over the feeding of the Hellenistic widows. He's an apostle. When you have the account in Acts chapter 2, they were paying attention, 42, to the apostles' teaching, the fellowship and breaking of bread. Many wonders and signs were taking place at the hand of the apostles. So he's an apostle. So very likely that he stayed there. And but the record doesn't continue to talk about his life. What we know about him is written in the gospel accounts, and that's where in the book of Acts it ends with him there, and then we go on from there. All right. Time and place of the writing. When do we find Matthew being written? And this is when you do a survey what comes in handy, because we can go back and we can look at historical facts in the first century. We know when certain things happen. For example, when did Nero burn Rome? 64. When did Rome destroy Jerusalem? 70. And these are not disputed facts, right? So we can go back and historically we can look at the destruction of these places and so forth. So when you're looking at dating a gospel or an epistle, one of the ways to do it is to consider what's written within the text and say, does it give us any indication of what was going on at the time, right? And that's one of the things that we do with Matthew, is because what Matthew talks about and what's taking place historically. Mainly, one of the key indicators is the destruction of Jerusalem. That's one of the things, because Matthew talks about that. There's two chapters in Matthew that are sometimes confused or confusing because of their accounts, Matthew 24, Matthew 25. And 25 is a judgment scene, right? That's where Jesus is speaking, the Lord is speaking, he's going to gather his sheep to the left, or to the right, and the goats to the left, right? Well, Matthew chapter 24 talks about this day coming, and there'll be one in the house, and one will be taken. And so people look at that as a tribulation type of event. Like, you see the movies where the guy's driving the car, like the tribulation force, whatever. He's driving the car, and then he just disappears. And the wife is like, where'd my husband go? Oh, the rapture. So they'll look at 24 in that way. They'll see it as more as a precursor to. But in fact, 24 is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, when it's going to be destroyed. So in going back and looking at what's written in a book or what's not written in a book, the fall of a major city or country is historical. Jerusalem, the city of David, this Zion, this place where the temple is of such importance to the Jews that if it's destroyed, that's not going to go unnoticed. When we read through Matthew, Matthew doesn't speak of a Jerusalem that's destroyed. And the fact that he's writing to primarily the Jews, that would be a great point for him to make in trying to get them to believe in Jesus as the Messiah. They could go back and he could look at the prophecies and bring that up to him. So that would be a great point to make and say, look, the city's been destroyed. Did not Jesus prophesy? Was this not written in the prophets that this was going to happen? He doesn't talk that way. He talks as if it's yet to come. So, and that's how we can go back and we can date this gospel account. Since the Decay and the writings of Ignatius show familiarity with Matthew's gospel, it must have been available by the time of these work, AD 110. Does anybody know what the Decay is? You know what that is? The Decay is a writing, and that's the way I pronounce it. I could be mispronouncing it, but I believe that's the correct way to say it. It's a treatise on the 12 apostles, and basically it's a small book that talks about the work of the apostles, the things that they did with the early church. It's not an inspired writing, but it was around. And in the Decay, Matthew is quoted often in there. So if you go to that writing, and we know that was in 110, and if that writing is mentioning the Gospel of Matthew, then you would put Matthew before that writing, right? It's before because he's writing about it. He's actually quoting out of Matthew. So he had to have the Matthew Gospel account available to him to quote from it, knew from it, right? Knew it. So you can go prior to AD 110. The Decay or teaching of the 12 apostles shows that Matthew 6, 9, etc. is used in admonishing Christians not to pray like hypocrites, but to use the Lord's Prayer. This is quoted from Matthew, and only minor liturgical changes and adds even the doxology found in Matthew in abbreviated form. So there's some changes in it, but that writing is not meant to be a copy of the gospel. It's almost like a commentary, right? The person's writing these things down, and as he's writing notes to people, like you would a sermon, as he's writing this, he's mentioning something, and then, of course, he quotes from the writing, and then he adds stuff of his own. So it's not an inspired document, it's just something that this was written and he's adding these things to it. But the fact that he's quoting from Matthew and taking writings from it shows that Matthew existed. The Decay mentions the Lord's yoke, Matthew 11:29, quotes Matthew 7:6, shows knowledge of Matthew 28:19, etc. In a various way reveals its intimacy with the Sermon of the Mount and with the first gospel in general. All this is done in the way which one would expect as the early date. The early use of our gospel makes the impression that Matthew, like the other three evangelists, was considered as one of the sacred writings known and established as authoritative throughout the church for many years. So if this person is quoting from it, then he's quoting it as church authority, right? This is what the church followed, this is the church practice, and he's telling people this is what we believe. So he's going back and he's quoting Matthew as an authoritative writing, something that they accepted and would have followed. Matthew implies that Jerusalem temple was still standing, which would indicate composition prior to AD 70. So we go no later than AD 110, right, because of the Decay, but we can go further back because we get to the fact that Matthew does not mention the destruction of Jerusalem. And that being the case, again, his audience, what he's trying to get across, it would seem that if that had taken place and he's trying to talk to a Jewish audience and convince them that Jesus is the Christ, this would be a way to do it. But he doesn't mention that. The date of Matthew is really a matter of conjecture. This is what Linsky has to say. At the latest, Matthew could have been written after the year 65 AD, probably even 5 years earlier. Some, however, have dated his writing about 20 years earlier. So I've seen somewhere between 35 and 45 AD, somewhere in there, when Matthew would have written this. The place of the writing is unknown, and not even a guess can be hazarded. So if we're looking at the date, and you're studying an overview, or you're studying Matthew, you can say, well, what is Matthew talking about? What's he mentioning? What's going on historically at the time? What do we know is taking place at the time? Who's ruling at the time? Do we have indicators of who's ruling and who he's talking to as rulers? You find that in Luke's writing, you know. When you go back to Luke, Luke mentions rulers, and that's a way for you to date the writing and the time frame when this is happening. So going back and look at Matthew, we don't have an exact date on it. We do know that we can date it before 110. The fact that he doesn't mention the destruction of Jerusalem puts it even further back to 70. Some would say 65, but if we're looking at 64, 65 when Nero burns Rome, that's not mentioned in there. And what comes out of the burning of Rome to the Christians, because Nero blames it on the Christians, and so there's a localized persecution that takes place. And Matthew doesn't seem to be dealing with those type of things. He seems to be really just focusing on the Jews and the kingdom and the prophecies and helping them to understand that Jesus is, and this is the key, Jesus is the Messiah. That's his focus. That would tend to indicate an early writing, right? Right after all this takes place, the focus early on in the church was to reach out to whom? Jews. The Jews. That was the focus early on, to reach out to the Jews. In fact, Paul even says that, to the Jew first and also to the Greek, time and again. And when you go back and you look at the mission that Jesus gave them, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, right? The Jews. So up front, the mission was to take the gospel message out to the Jewish people. Not that the Gentiles didn't hear it and so forth, but that was the focus. And being that Matthew is heavily focused on a Jewish audience, then an earlier date and the lack of mention of the destruction of Jerusalem or what Nero does, that tends to bring it even further back to somewhere about 35, 45 AD, somewhere in there, where it's going to have its greatest impact immediately on the Jewish community, because those are the ones that are going to hear this message right away. So likely we can move it back to 35, 45. And if you go through and look at some of the early writings, writers of the time, they've accepted that early date as well, that you can go back that far and not damage anything that's being written in the text itself. All right. So then we have, let me see how far we got here. Yeah, we'll stop here. All right, so next week, and we'll finish up with Matthew next week, we're going to look at key words that you find in Matthew. And again, one of the points about key words is what is being most often spoken of. And I'm going to look up what you said, Ken. I'm going to see if there's some mention of that in there, because that would be, and again, a key word doesn't mean that that's the central focus of the gospel, that gospel account, what he's trying to do. When you go back and look at, and this is very interesting, when you go back and you look at what Matthew writes, the key words are very revealing in who he's writing to and what he's trying to affect in the lives of these Jewish people. And I think that's really an interesting thing as you look at the number of times he uses these words in referencing certain things. And you go, wow, if you lay that out, you can really see what he's trying to do in this writing, who he's trying to reach with this writing, and his approach, and what he's hoping to come from what he's saying, especially if he says it over and over and over and over again, right? So,